Salmond.
No, basically because in order to guarantee that no youngster would be lured into terrorism, you'd have to have the sort of surveillance systems that no free society could tolerate. And it's always going to be the case that people are going to fall for the propaganda, particularly the propaganda through the social media. I think the questions we should ask are not so much about why one or two people get through the net, or perhaps more than one or two people. I think the questions we should ask are about why that's happening. What can we offer people to provide a position where it's less attractive to go off to fight in faraway lands and have what would be probably a very short as unpleasant existence. So I think it's impractical to say that the security service or police can stop everyone falling victim to it, and I think it would be far better to organise ourselves better in order to have that process of education where people weren't attracted to that sort of life. I would say that today there was some good news that a youngster in Scotland was prevented from going to join terrorist organisation, and that was done by a combination of the police service and the local mosque. So I think we should remember that for all the stories we hear about how people got through the net, there are probably many stories of people who've been dissuaded from flinging their lives away in international terrorism.
You said at the back.
Guarantee they can stop everyone. And I think Alex Salmond is correct when he says that we've got to work out what is drawing these young Muslims to IS and other radical groups. I think that there is a problem here in this country in acknowledging what the problem actually is. To reform their religion.
Melanie, we've got the point. Alex Salmond.
You cannot argue that the Western world has been immune from religious fanaticism. There's been plenty of religious fanaticism in these islands. And therefore, you've got to be careful. I mean, you said earlier something I actually agree with.
For a few centuries.
Well, in these islands, some people might argue that the tragedy in Ireland had something, at least, to do with religious fanaticism. That's not a few centuries ago, Lionel. That's not even a few decades ago. So let's not, sort of say, well, there's one part of the world is subject to religious fanaticism, but we're, a bit more wise than that. You said something earlier, which I thought was very important, about narrative. It isn't impossible or even difficult to construct a narrative that the Western world has been responsible for chaos in many Islamic countries. It's not difficult to construct that narrative at all. And therefore, it might be of assistance in constructing a counter-narrative if, for example, we collectively as a society might apologise for an illegal war in Iraq. We might actually apologise for the parts of the narrative which can be constructed by terrorist organisations to lure young people.
So you think the blame is on us?
No, I didn't say that. I said that the narrative that we have to offer as an alternative might be helped if we admitted there were aspects of Western policy that can be presented and construed as destabilising Islamic countries. We have to understand.
Looking a bit sceptical.
Yeah, look, I think the Iraq war was wrong, and I think some of it's been used by those who want to use it against us to motivate these kids. But bear in mind something else. Look at the...
And oil?
Oh, well, I think that actually the first of these, rather than the second, was the reason why Norway decided not to join the European Union. They were, and somebody's here in the House of Commons just now about whether David Cameron is going to have treaty change. If he is going to get treaty change, I hope it's the common fisheries policy that is the treaty change, because I think it's one of the worst aspects, and I think that's what Norway... Lionel, I don't think, said that this country couldn't survive outside the European Union. That wasn't the point he was making. But equally, the question we were asked is, would it be so bad? And I think the difficulty we're taking Switzerland and Norway as the examples, Lionel, is that very few people would regard them as so bad. I mean, most people would say Switzerland and Norway are doing all right, thank you very much, albeit you're carefully correct that they have the inconvenience of having to follow all European regulations without having a seat at the table. My attitude to this is much more fundamental. I think England's a European nation. I think Scotland's a European nation. I think these nations should be part of the European association. I think it would be denying the reality of history not to be part of that. I would never argue that the United Kingdom wasn't capable of standing on its own 2 feet outside the European Union. Of course it would be. But that doesn't mean the same thing as saying it's not to our advantage to be part of that trading and regulatory construct. Of course it is. I think there are more important issues in mobile phone charges, although it's a perfectly legitimate current example. But I do think that we should be actually thinking about this European debate, not about what Europe shouldn't be doing, but more about what Europe should be doing. See, my dissatisfaction with Europe is not what you hear in the House of Commons. My dissatisfaction with Europe, I want to see a European Union that does something decisive about the boat people in the Mediterranean. You know, I want to see a European Union that does something decisive about climate change. I want to see a European Union that gets back to the call for a social Europe, that actually implements and facilitates a living wage for people, as opposed to making it awkward. That my type of Europe would do a lot more than the European Union we have at the present moment.
Right.
And that may put me in a minority, well, not a minority, I was going to say a small minority, a big minority in the House of Commons, the SNP now. But nonetheless, we should have a positive case for staying in Europe, not the sort of negative stuff that we hear at the present moment.
Thank you.
Lionel, you
You
spoke about all of the options to cross or
well,
tick
our
on the ballot
expert on
paper.
referendums is sitting here. Very, very brief, Alex, if you would. But just...
Can I say to the gentleman, I actually don't think the potential bias is in the question. I think you're right to be worried about bias, and what you should be worried about is the activities of government during the referendum period. We had a debate in the Commons this week, and there was a vote which actually could have defeated the government if the Labour Party hadn't abstained on it on the Purdah period. And Purdah is this period, the 30 days before a referendum, where governments are restricted in what they can do, and where the civil service who are restricted in what they can do. So I think, if I could say to you, sir, you're right to look for bias, but I think you should look beyond the question and look to the nefarious activities of government ministers and senior civil servants.
Okay. I agree with you, but a neutral question would be a good start.
All right. Let's leave the EU for the moment. We'll come...
Can't leave for a moment.
Yeah, only for the moment. Right, and we go on to another question. This is from Barbara Aldridge, please.
Should Nobel Prize-winning scientist Sir Tim Hunt have been forced to quit his job?
Melanie Phillips. You know the story, of course, the Nobel Prize winner who made some in the House of Commons about Anna Soubry when you said, "Behave yourself, woman," well. and you were taken to task for it. I know you have an explanation, but I've no doubt you have an explanation, is what I mean.
Okay.
But what,
behave yourself, man.
Yes, which you say you've said all the time, but I didn't think you do very often.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes, I do. But I think on the question of Sir Timothy, I read a very dignified interview by his wife, I think it was in The Observer, and she was talking about his whole career. She also said he was an idiot, he shouldn't have said what he said, it was a stupid thing to say, and she pointed out she should never have married him if he was a sexist. But, you know, just because somebody is bad at making speeches or clumsy in how they express themselves and says a stupid thing, it doesn't mean they're not a good scientist. I think it's possible to be a good scientist and to be a very bad speaker. The interesting thing about that interview is Sir Timothy's wife is herself a very prominent academic, I think, in the sciences. And, you know, I just think that most people would think Sir Timothy should have been ridiculed by all means in the social media, should have been taken to task, should have apologised, not least to his wife for embarrassing her because of his daft attitudes. But losing your job or your post over it seems to me disproportionate.
Okay. And the woman here in the second row, thank you. Do we have a responsibility to help them? Alex Salmond.
Yes, we do. The responsibility is in a number of levels. I mean, firstly, it's just a human responsibility. I hear a lot about, and I think it's deliberate confusion between economic migration and people seeking sanctuary. But the United Nations agencies have identified that 60,000 of the people who've arrived in Italy and Greece are refugees and are entitled to international protection. I mean, in a nutshell, that means if they're sent back, they'll be killed. They'll die. If they don't die in the Mediterranean, they'll die if they're sent back to their countries. And of course we have an obligation to take part in the European, the international effort to resettle these people.
Which we're excluded from at the moment, or excluding ourselves.
No, we're not excluded from both. We're included in a voluntary way in the 20,000 international migrants. We're excluded from the 40,000. Now, if we take the 20,000, where we have an obvious obligation, I think the figure for the UK is 2,309 would be the figure would have to be resettled in the United Kingdom. And now, if we mind, some people in this audience will probably remember it more than I do, but back in the early 1970s, the government of Edward Heath took in 40,000 Ugandan Asians who were fleeing from the tyranny of Idi Amin. And these people, and I saw a list of the sons, the daughters, the grandchildren of these people, have gone on to great things.
British passport holders, weren't they?
They were British, yes, but there was a...
Important distinction.
Well, I wonder if it is.
Well, a distinction.
Is there the question we're asked about moral obligation? I think we've got an absolute moral obligation in the interests of humanity to do our share, to take our part in a European effort to help people in extremity. There is a second area, and it comes back to the thing we mentioned earlier on. If you look at many of the places these people are fleeing from, then this country and others had a substantial role in destabilisation of these countries. The refugees from Iraq, from Libya. And you cannot just disregard the interventions, the reckless military interventions and the aftermath and the consequences of them. So our responsibility lies in two levels. One, that we have an obligation in terms of common humanity to help people in severe distress. And secondly, the blundering interventions that we took part in as a country are partly responsible for the appalling situation we now face in the Mediterranean.
Thank you. We have to keep moving, so we don't have all that much time left.